this question to both of you guys. I think this is a point that I don't think is discussed enough. But when we're talking about terrorism, who defines that and why? I think that's probably a fair question because if you look, I mean, historically, you might actually consider somebody like George Washington a terrorist because they committed acts of violence for a political cause. But in a more contemporary sense, the United States right now, let's say, is attempting I think the Senate is attempting to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and of course, many groups around the world have already done so.
Yep.
And the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, recently designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So I guess just to both of you guys, because Mujtaba, you remembered or you brought up the double standard.
Mm.
Who defines what is terrorism, and is that in of itself also a political agenda or a political cause?
Well, it's no doubt a political cause, depending who you're speaking to. For example, if you look at Turkey and Erdogan's opinion, um, he had no problem with ISIS being on the border, but as soon as the Kurds got closer, you see him um, bringing out threats that he's going to do this and that, mainly because he views the Kurds, or specifically the PKK and other affiliates, as a bigger threat to Turkey, and therefore he identifies them as the terrorist threat. If you're looking at, for example, Saudi Arabia, they see groups like Hezbollah, as you said, or countries in the GCC as the terrorist organization, or the fundamental threat, as well as Iran, um, and therefore you start noticing that terrorism becomes very subjective. Everyone views terrorism based on who their main enemy is, and just on a subtopic, I believe this is a bigger problem when we're fighting ISIS as a universal common enemy, because every other organization or every other group or every other country sees ISIS as the secondary enemy. For example, we could say that Iran sees Saudi as the enemy, or they see the rebel groups in Syria as the enemy, whereas Assad also sees groups in Syria as also the primary enemy in defeating them, because they pose a greater threat to his existence. We see Turkey, as I said, who view the PKK as a threat and the real terror threat to them. Um, and so you start observing that terrorism becomes subjective to those who are speaking about it, and that's why I think it's very difficult to get hold of what terrorism is that is commonly accepted, and that's why we have this distinct difference of opinion on various groups who are classified as terrorism in some countries, but are not classified as terrorism in other countries. And this is not going into the vocabulary of it. I know in America they have this issue with the right wing terrorism, that is not defined as right wing terrorism. That's a whole
Yeah.
completely different topic. But I do think that it seems to be a subjective issue from just observing the narratives that we see.
Yeah, just to build on that, I completely agree. I think you expressed it really well. There's no question that internationally, especially when you look at politicians, political leaders, they tend to define terrorism very subjectively. It's a means of discrediting dissidents in
Mm.
building up support to snuff them out, often violently. And so, for that reason, not only is there no consensus over the definition of terrorism, but I think it's safe to say that there will never be a consensus because leaders have different enemies or perceived enemies. And so they're going to attach the term differently depending on their threats. That said, even though there's no consensus internationally, especially among political leaders, academics, especially social scientists in the United States um, and in Europe, usually other areas of North America and Australia, academics tend to have a standardized definition where there's less wiggle room. It tends to consist of three parts. First, we're talking about a non state actor. So we're not talking about governments. we're talking about a individual, often called a lone wolf, or a small cell or a larger organization, who uses violence against a civilian target. So we're not talking about, blowing the treads off of a tank. We're talking about, blowing up markets and cafes and things, for some sort of a political goal, whatever that political goal may be. So there's no consensus over this either. But among academics, certainly, my colleagues who study terrorism, we do tend to be pretty much on the same page. And that's really useful because one of the main things that we're trying to do is to predict terrorism, to make predictions about it. And if we don't have a shared understanding of what we're talking about, then our predictions will be meaningless.